Hey gang, this week's episode is brought to you by oldschoolshirts.com. Hey, check them out. You like defunct teams and leagues and t-shirt form? Well, you'll find them there, but a whole bunch of other stuff too. Do you remember a radio station of the past or perhaps a mall that you used to go to? All kinds of great cultural and sports memories can be found at the great folks at oldschoolshirts.com. Promo code GOODSEATS for 10% off all of your purchases. And now, here's our show.
Se lo perdió Raifi y ahora de contragolpe Donovan. Se le va larga Donovan. La quiere por derecha Altidor. Al área viene. Y cita por arquero. Donovan, gol. ¡Gol! Donovan tomó el rebote de una jugada que él comenzó de contragolpe después de que se había salvado el equipo de Estados Unidos de la derrota. Leander Donovan, el mejor jugador en la historia de los Estados Unidos, está convirtiendo el gol en el descuento que le consigue la clasificación a la siguiente ronda del Mundial.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Hey now, how are you everybody? It's Tim Hanlon. It's Good Seats Still Available. It's the curious little podcast that's devoted to what used to be in professional sports. How you doing? And my goodness, where were you on June 23rd, 2010? I think if you were a U.S. soccer fan, you will remember that call, even if that wasn't the language you were watching the United States national soccer team playing in the third game of their round in the World Cup that year in South Africa. Of course, that was the dulcet tones and the inimitable voice of now Telemundo's, back then it was Univision's, Andres Cantor, who is essentially the Spanish language voice of international soccer here in the U.S. And it was an incredible match, the third game of three opening round games against Algeria, when Landon Donovan, perhaps one of the greatest players, if not the greatest player, debatable, we'll talk about that some other point, in U.S. national team history, in the 90th plus 1 minute, first minute of overtime or extra time, scoring the only goal in that game in a dramatic fashion. And as you might know, Andres Cantor has said publicly in interviews since then that he came very close to passing out because of exhaustion and the emotion of that moment. The United States qualifying for the next round, the round of 16, where they lost to Ghana. But still, that's a huge feat that they had not accomplished, getting to the knockout rounds since the last time they did was 2002. So quite some time, and sadly also losing to Ghana in that round of 16 in the 93rd minute in that game a couple days later. But regardless, you now know where we're going with this conversation this week. Our guest is Leander Schaerlaeckens. He is a well-known soccer author, historian, and thematic writer in and around the game of soccer. You may know him for his work at ESPN or Fox Sports and Yahoo Sports. He's written all over the place, places like The Guardian and The Ringer. He teaches journalism and sports communication at Marist University. It just has a wondrous sense of where this game is going in terms of the United States national team. And from a detached point of view, he's a Dutch native raised in Belgium, went to college in London and in D.C., Washington, D.C. So he comes kind of at this with a European's sort of sensibility, but also a bit of objectivity, if you will, without sort of the homerism, about the past, the present, and we'll get into the future of the U.S. national team, the U.S. men's national team specifically, as we get set for the World Cup still coming up in a couple of weeks. Yours truly still looking for decently priced tickets. I'm not alone, by the way. But as we get ready to sit back and who knows what's going to transpire with this tournament, both on and off the field. But the U.S. national team, it's time to at least talk about how competitive they will be. And frankly, the background, the history of this team in World Cup competition and generally to kind of put everything in perspective. And that's the topic of this conversation this week. You're going to enjoy this, especially if you're not a U.S. soccer aficionado or been following, but even if you have been, you will enjoy this chat with Leander. And we're going to celebrate his book that I highly recommend if you want to look smart in the stands or at the bar or wherever you're consuming the World Cup this coming season, and you fancy yourself as a U.S. soccer fan or people around you who are going to be rooting for the U.S., perhaps naively, but it's okay. We'll take the fans however they come. But a little bit of insight that perhaps makes you a standout at that party or that gathering. The book is called The Long Game, U.S. Men's Soccer and Its Savage 4-Decade Journey to the Top, or Thereabouts. It is published by Viking, and we will have a handful of copies to give away at the end of the show with a trivia question. So give a listen through the entirety of this show, as well as for that question near the end. I think you'll enjoy this discussion very much, because this is a story of, the nation of the United States trying to figure out its way with the sport of soccer. And Lord knows we've talked a lot about the ups and downs and sidewayses of all of that over the last century or two. And, people forget that the United States actually beat England in 1950, which was a huge surprise and shock. People forget that the United States was part of the first World Cups when the whole competition was started in the 1930s, and even had a professional league or two even a few years before then. And the game has been played largely from an immigrant kind of dynamic as this country was being built in the post-war Reconstruction and Industrial Revolution and stuff. And it's had its flirtations with professionalism, certainly in the late 1960s for the first time, coming out of a 1966 World Cup that was actually televised in the United States, albeit in tape delay fashion. We've gone long and hard in terms of the American Soccer League and how it kind of soldiered on and then professionalized itself even further to compete with the North American Soccer League, its dazzling sister, and all of that coming to a crashing end in 1984, 1985. The depths of the pro game and the ability of the U.S. to play on the world stage in the years thereafter, and the rising from the ashes by winning the bid to host the 1994 World Cup and the league that followed from it, Major League Soccer, 2 years after that. And it's still around, and we've got United Soccer Leagues and their various levels of pro play, and more franchises coming left and right, and soccer-specific stadiums and all kinds of stuff. So it is really an interesting time to be a fan of the U.S. national team, U.S. men's national team, soccer generally, and a great opportunity to speculate about how the United States is going to show up or not in this upcoming World Cup. Let's look back, shall we, at the various World Cup doings of this team over the decades, and perhaps we can divine a little bit of insight as to where they might land this season, this year, in this World Cup approaching in a few weeks' time. Here's our conversation we had with Leander a couple of months back. We've been holding it back because we wanted to time this more closely to the release of the book. Please, as always, enjoy. You're talking to a long-suffering United States soccer fan who kind of got his whistle wetted in the crazy years of the North American Soccer League, especially in the late 70s with the New York Cosmos, with season tickets, Giant Stadium, Northern New Jersey. Thought that was the world. That was the center of the world was that. And of course, like a lot of U.S. soccer fans at the time who got hooked then, essentially became abandoned in the early 80s when the league exploded and then went away, and everything seemed to be right down the tubes. When did you and how do you come to this United States national team story? Because I will tell you that it was on the periphery of my NASL fandom, but once that league went away, in many respects, it was kind of the only thing or any thread, truly, and frayed at that was still around. And that's why I really became intrigued with the possibilities going forward, maybe someday sort of again. But certainly what was before, because there's a rich history there. How did you come to it?
I kind of followed the U.S. national team entirely by accident. When we moved to the United States in 2009, I, a young journalist, needed a job. I had worked in Brussels, which is my hometown, as a stringer for United Press International and the Washington Times, which still is a conservative newspaper in Washington, D.C., because those are the jobs that were available to me. And I covered NATO and the European Union. I'd gotten my undergrad degree in journalism at City University in London. And as a soccer nut, I had done you had to do these required internship days. I did all of mine on the sports desk of The Guardian because that was really my passion. And my second year of working in Brussels, covering politics, really, I talked The Guardian into letting me write the Dutch soccer column. So after that, we moved to the United States. I applied for every job in journalism under the sun. Don't get any of them until finally ESPN had just made a big gamble on the World Cup. John Skipper, the president at the time, was really sort of going all in on the 2010 World Cup. And ESPN was going to start really covering soccer the way it did other sports. And so they hired for the first time 2 full-time writers that January of 2010. I was one of them. Jeff Carla was the other, although I think he came on a few months later. And that was the only job I could get, was with ESPN as a staff writer covering soccer.
Hey, not a bad gig to get. I mean, let's be honest. I mean, you're hooking yourself up to the worldwide sports leader, quote unquote. So, maybe maybe not. All you need is one. That's a pretty darn good one, right?
Yes. Yeah. No. That was. I tell this to my students all the time. When they're I'm a lecturer in sports communication and journalism at Marist University. And, when my seniors are freaking out, I tell them this story. I was like, I could not get hired by local papers to cover high school sports or really anything else. And then ESPN comes knocking, and that's a fluke and that's an outlier. And it turned out that I got lucky because the soccer editor there at the time, who was on his way out, had read my Guardian column. And so he knew me and he wanted me on board. And so that was when suddenly it was my job to cover the U.S. national team. And so I got sent out to January camp in 2010, which of course is MLS players, not sort of the full national team squad. And basically got told, okay, write a story every day. And I had no idea who these guys were, because while I'd been a soccer obsessive all my life, and while I'd had some bylines in World Soccer Magazine and The Guardian, I didn't know these guys. So I sort of fell into following that team entirely by accident. And then ever since, it's really been my job, whether full-time or part-time. But I also kind of fell in love, not so much the team itself, because you're not supposed to do that as a reporter, right? There's no cheering in the press box. But I really fell in love with their story and just the arc of this team and just how unbelievably far they came from the early 1980s to now. And that's what the book is really about.
So you're clearly coming from a European appreciation of the game, right? Which is far richer and deeper and full of texture versus the, by comparison, underreported or underappreciated history of the game here in this country. I've clearly have seen and heard that this is a very rich history here too. It's just unlike baseball, which is arguably historically over analyzed. Soccer has so much richness, almost of similar length here. But I guess the question really in that is, how do you approach the national team story in that? And I don't want to, from a European perspective, which is probably more knowledgeable, maybe, I don't want to say arrogantly so, but certainly logically understandable. How do you approach it without sort of a held nose, so to speak? Because, outside, right, in the United States' soccer history around the world is not, it's kind of looked upon as like, oh, the U.S., they don't care about soccer.
I don't think it ever occurred to me to hold my nose at American soccer. I mean, maybe I was born in the Netherlands, and the Dutch league, by the time I was sort of following the sport, was very quickly becoming less relevant in the European firmament. I grew up in Belgium, where the league had already sort of collapsed is not the right word, but had fallen really far from the relevance it had once enjoyed. Ironically, because of the Bosman arrest, which is a European Court of Justice ruling in the mid 90s, which basically handed soccer players in the EU their free agency, and which was a Belgian case. And if a Belgian club and the Belgian Federation had treated their players slightly better, then it would have taken longer for free agency to be enacted in European soccer, and it would have saved the Belgian league probably. But so at any rate, I'd sort of been used to covering smaller leagues, as it were, and I just always found the American soccer story just really compelling. I mean, I'm the way I like to put it is I love soccer. Just the action on the field and the sport and the technique and the drama, fabulous. Nevertheless, what goes on the field is the least interesting thing about soccer to me, because it's the geopolitics and it's the business and it's the culture and it's the dynamics of it. And it's just an endlessly interesting and complicated sport. So I think the big difference when you talk about sort of how do you assess the American game is that there's a continuity in soccer and its history in European countries, right? The Dutch league has been more or less the same since 1957, I want to say, is when it went professional. The Premier League is split off from the football league in the early 1990s, but it's looked more or less the same for more than 100 years, right? And that's true with their national teams as well. They function on a continuum. And that's not true in the United States, where you have this sort of brief golden era in the 1920s when some teams in the American Soccer League arguably had some of the deepest teams in the world. The U.S. goes to the 1930 World Cup and comes third. In 1950, they stun the English at the World Cup. And then the sport just kind of goes away, right? And really, after the Great Depression, the sport had already begun to crumble, and 1950 was kind of this fluky outlier. But it really becomes this regional amateur sport where, here and there, guys are maybe making $20 a game. But while it's developing at breakneck pace all around the world, the US is kind of sidelined, right? For decades and decades and decades until, the NASL, your beloved NASL has a brief heyday and then kind of collapses under its own dysfunction. And then the national team really doesn't get it together until the late 80s, right? So you can't sort of see and assess American soccer in the same way that you would the European game, because it consists of chapters, right? It's not just one long ongoing story. And I just find that every single one of those chapters is interesting in its own right, because they all have their own drama and their own sort of narrative arc and their own failings and their own sort of brief moments of promise. And it's just, if you're in the storytelling business and if you think of soccer primarily as a series of just good stories, it's hard to find a country that gives you more material than the United States.
You kind of have an informal marker in and around kind of the 1980s. And I'm intrigued with how you sort of came about that as the modern day, if you will, or the starting point for this sort of part of the U.S. soccer journey. Because, look, in the absence of the aforementioned NASL, right, it went away, and a lot of soccer fans felt duped and or abandoned and or worse. And it was also interesting, too, because I think a lot of people who kind of got hooked on the sport during certainly in the 1970s via the NASL and even the ASL, which professionalized itself even more. And then indoor game was popping up and stuff, too, that the idea of a national team and the World Cup was still also literally and figuratively foreign, because the U.S. quote unquote national team hadn't really been a factor. I think to some people wouldn't even recognize that we even had a national team without a little investigation. But why the 80s? I mean, I certainly knew personally things hopefully had to change, but it did feel pretty dire during this period of time. Why did you choose that area, and maybe what were the signs that you more objectively saw to make the 80s kind of the Renaissance period, perhaps, begin?
Yeah, so there's a few things that happen at the same time. On the one hand, the 1982, I believe, Colombia basically says, "Okay, I know you gave us you gave us the 1986 World Cup, but we're having such a terrible time with narco violence and just chaos in our country. We can't host it." And so the 86 World Cup suddenly is up for grabs, and the U.S. decides to go after it. So does Canada, so does Mexico. And so that presented opportunity. And so that gave the Federation a spark of like, okay, we need to try to go for this. And that ultimately gets the ball rolling for the U.S. hosting in 1994. They don't get the 1986 World Cup because Mexico, even though it has a much, much thinner bid and sort of, I believe I was told their entire bid book was like under 10 pages or something like that. But they had hosted in 1970 and they basically said, hey, that was a success. We've got the stadiums. We're a safe pair of hands. We're ready to go. And so FIFA, which has, I believe, 2 Mexicans on the executive committee at that time, says, yeah, okay, let's go back to Mexico. But so that kind of sparked something in the U.S. Federation. At the same time, the national team program on the men's side, on the women's, it doesn't even exist yet, is so disheveled that they are playing at most 1 game a year because the Federation just couldn't afford to put on more games. They basically play their World Cup qualifiers, which never lasts very long because they get knocked out in some early round. And then they play maybe a game a year if they play at all. And it was common for players to turn down national team call-ups because it wasn't worth their time. They were playing for $5 a day per diems. There was one story I found that for a World Cup qualifier in the 1970s, the U.S. didn't even have 11 players show up, and they had to pull someone from the stands to make up the numbers. So they're barely getting paid. It's amateur hour. This thing is going nowhere. But so they decide there's a little bit of energy, like, all right, let's try to get this right. So they decide to enter the national team into the NASL, into the dying NASL in 1983 as Team America. Now, just a little explainer here.
Oh boy, yeah, this is a fun one for sure. We've talked about this with Pablo Mayer and a couple of others. But go ahead. I'll never get tired of it.
So briefly, there's 2 kinds of soccer, right? For your listeners, there's international soccer and there's club soccer. And your club is who you have your contract with and who you play with every day, and then you kind of freelance if you get called up to your national team. You play for your country, sort of on the side. So this crossover is really unusual. Right? They're like, okay, we're going to take the national team and we're going to turn it into a club team and we're going to enter it into the NASL. It goes terribly wrong. They come last. They have the fewest goals scored. It's not even really the national team because several of the star players like Ricky Davis, they ask themselves like, well, hang on a minute. I play for the New York Cosmos. It's not good for me. And I don't think ultimately good for the national team for me to give that up to go play with this team. So it all ends in tears. They have one terrible season and then they fold. But nevertheless, it's another spark. It's another sort of spasm of ambition as they start to kind of rebuild this national team. And then they try to take what little momentum they've gathered into the 1986 Olympics. That doesn't go terribly well. The 1984 Olympics, but in Los Angeles, and they don't do great there. But at least the national team is sort of something of a professional seeming environment again. And then before the 1990 World Cup, they start the qualifying cycle in 1988 by the Federation actually for the first time says, we are going to hand full-time contracts to our players because not nearly enough of them were playing professionally. So there's another investment there and there's another spark there. They say, we're going to take this seriously. We're going to actually pay these guys so that they can devote more time and energy to the national team. And then that ultimately leads to qualification for the 1990 World Cup and really the rebirth of this program. But all of that starts in the early 1980s, which was a time of such mayhem sort of colliding with ambition, which I just found fascinating.
Yeah, and I know you talk about some of these things in the book too, but back in the early 80s when specifically what year, what month, whatever, that the 82 Cup was, excuse me, the 86 World Cup was up for bid, NASL was starting to wobble violently. And there was discussion, I believe Henry Kissinger was part of this mix, and others trying to basically try to salvage the league by somehow getting this World Cup at the time to kind of be the sort of kill two birds with one stone, so to speak. So clearly that was a spasm of activity. And you also saw, the Team America experiment. We've had Ricky Davis on this show a number of years ago, and he still to this day doesn't talk to Jeff Durgan, who was one of the guys who primarily said, "I'm going to stay with the Cosmos." And sorry, it was Jeff Durgan. Yeah, no, one of the two. Who is it? Jeff Durgan, I think, went to this Team America, and Ricky Davis stayed back, and they don't talk to each other to this day, right? Because one chose the national team, so to speak, and the other one decided that, it didn't make economic sense. I mean, it's crazy times. But I remember vividly in 1986 when the U.S. was trying to qualify. I mean, this is how desperate one becomes when one has lost any semblance of fandom in the United States. I mean, I would put my relatives during the holidays through hours of watching Spanish television to watch this World Cup qualifying thing that made no sense to anybody else in my family except myself, and was just completely, devastated when the U.S., all they had to do was win. Sorry, they only had to tie Costa Rica in the last game, the qualifying, to make the 1986 World Cup, the first time in many years, and they didn't get it done. And it was like, for somebody who knew enough about what this nadir was, right, to be kicked in the stomach. I mean, there must have been literally dozens of others out there in the country that I've only reconnected with over the decades, but it could not have gotten lower at that point for the small club of folk who cared about games like that. And to see it in the late 80s finally get to that point in 1989 when that magic goal, was scored against Trinidad and Tobago to kind of get them in the 90 Cup. Is just, anybody who's lived through that period of time here and was a fan will know just the depths that they went through.
Yeah, I mean, it's such an extraordinary story, right? So starting with Team America, Ricky Davis actually published a op-ed in the New York Times in the sports section where he said, "I think this is a bad idea." He said, "If you're going to make this investment in putting this team together, why not, if the whole purpose here is to re-energize the national team, you're actually not going to accomplish that if you pull the best American players out of every other NASL franchise, because only 11 of them can play. And it'll actually wind up being less net playing time for the national team players if you go this route. What if instead we took this money and after the NASL season, which was fairly short, it was like late spring to early fall, if instead we took that money and went on an extended 3, 4, 5-month tour after the NASL season, so we'd get more playing time, we'd still get a bunch of time together." And his argument made eminent sense, and nobody listened. I think it was also the league itself was desperate and was very eager to do this. The team owner, Robert Lifton, didn't really know much about soccer, and the league commissioner had this idea that, this is Reaganism and that whole period, that what the NASL was lacking was American flavor. And so he was on a campaign of Americanization of the league, and therefore having Team America would be good. And so it would at once revitalize the national team and the league. And of course it did neither.
So clearly the 1990 World Cup, qualifying for that, probably was, I don't know if it was justification for all the efforts that had been made to date, but it certainly didn't hurt. So there might have been conjecture perhaps as to whether this was the fruit of lots of labor in the fields that people weren't sort of recognizing, or just a stacking up of experiences that they learned from, or frankly, good luck, or maybe a combination of the two. But I don't think anybody denies the fact that qualifying in 89, especially given having accepted or won the bid for the 1994 World Cup, I mean, you could not have stacked those events better than that. Tell us about this early 90s period, because clearly this is when the fertilizer and the seeds are really starting to happen, despite the fact that essentially the U.S. kind of forgot to show up in 1990. But that's another story.
Well, I mean, it's interesting you say that because the way I put it in the book is that this game in Trinidad and Tobago, where the U.S. finally qualifies for a World Cup for the first time in 40 years, is considered something of a miracle, right? It's like this miraculous game. Actually, what happened in that qualifying cycle was like a half dozen miracles because you talk to the players. And they say none of those games were easy. Like it was Tab Ramos said, we would tie Guatemala at home, and it was never like, oh yeah, okay, we were expecting that point. It was always, oh my God, we got a point against Guatemala. This is incredible. And Tony Meola, who'd been drafted in as the goalkeeper, I think he was 20 or 21 at the time, still playing college soccer, he kept 4, 5, maybe 6 clean sheets towards the second half of that that final qualifying round. If he lets in a single goal, the U.S. does not go to that World Cup. It was incredibly close call, again and again and again. And so finally, under Bob Gansler, they make it to the World Cup, and it doesn't go great. But they sort of create a proof of concept, right? Sort of towards the end of that World Cup, things are starting to look a little bit better, and it's evident that this team can play internationally, even though its players have no pedigree whatsoever. There was also an argument from Gansler who said, I could have brought a stronger team to the 1990 World Cup. If there were a few guys like Ricky Davis, even though he wasn't entirely fit, like Hugo Perez, I think, if I'd brought those guys, we might have been a better team. But I was planning, the way he put it was, I wasn't just planning for 90, I was planning for the 90s, because he expected to be kept on as head coach for the 94 World Cup, even though, of course, he wasn't, and Bora Milutinovic came in his place. But so he thought, I'm going to get some runway here, and we're going to treat this World Cup as a bit of a general rehearsal for when we have the World Cup on home soil. But, of course, it didn't work out that way.
So we had Alan Rothenberg on a few weeks back, and obviously he's got some very concrete memories of being in that sort of chief builder role as the World Cup in 94 was getting going. Obviously, he was part of the Olympic soccer stuff in 1984 here in the United States. A lot of building blocks behind the scenes, a lot of efforts, a lot of resources, maybe for the first time, at least in generations, if not at all, forever. But maybe you can kind of describe kind of the U.S. national team as part of that mixture, because 1994 is a far different situation, right? I mean, arguably not a whole lot of American fans, aside from us diehards, saw the 1990 World Cup on TNT in a bar somewhere, being the only ones watching the games. But 1994 is a different story because it's a world stage and everybody's here and filled stadiums, and this U.S. team has got to show up, and more than just show up. It almost feels to me like this period of time was like all hands on deck, right? This can't, not only is a dress rehearsal, but this has got to be, we got to get a couple of accolades here and win some games and be somewhat relevant for as long as we can go.
Yeah, so Rothenberg and U.S. Soccer as the organizing committee, which is different from this time around, where the home federation for the first time isn't really all that involved in organizing the World Cup, but they would probably need an entire separate show for FIFA's shenanigans. But they'd gone big on this thing. They set the ticket prices aggressively. They booked some of the biggest stadiums they could get. They were in the Rose Bowl, and they were in the Pontiac Silverdome. And they decided to take a really big swing at this World Cup, which was not a given. There was also a plan at one point to be more conservative and to play in smaller venues in smaller towns and charge less money. And there was a poll about a month before the World Cup, and I believe it said something like 80% of Americans had no idea what the World Cup was, and let alone that it was going to be in their country, right? And this is just a few weeks before this thing is going to kick off. Alexi Lawless got on just a commercial flight a few weeks before the World Cup, and he sat next to this lady on the plane. And this is, of course, weeks before he becomes a superstar. And, they get to talking, and he tries to explain to her that he plays soccer for a living and that he's on the national team. And she just flat out doesn't believe him. She just doesn't believe that an American could be doing such a thing, right? So that's sort of the landscape weeks before this thing happens. And then, of course, they take the country by storm. It helps that the US does well, of course, because that's the sort of country we are. I suppose most countries are with World Cups. And it just fundamentally changes the landscape and changes the kind of, it opens this window of opportunity where not only can you get MLS up and running, although it was supposed to start in 1995 rather than 96, but you also now have a sort of entry point into the mainstream culture that the men's national team had just never had before, that it just never been afforded that chance to really make an impression on people and to be on TV a lot, and for its players to be on magazine covers and on the late night talk shows and all the rest. So it really, in a month, just changes everything.
Well, that too, and also the promise of a pro league, which was a FIFA mandate, right? So a lot was on the line. It wasn't just this tournament, but it also is the legacy that was literally forced to be part of that mixture. I remember going to that first U.S. game in the World Cup of '94 at the Pontiac Silverdome, and not only was it humid because it was played indoors and it was grass that was brought in and stuff, it was ungodly humid because it was hot too. Talk about like butterflies and then some, right? I mean, the fact that they scored and tied Switzerland, I mean, was a huge relief. And I remember just almost touching the ceiling. I was jumping so high when we scored to tie that game. I mean, talk about like, don't blow this, right? I mean, this is like it, right? And the fact that they were not only competitive, but they tied a relatively strong team and then, won a game later and went on to Brazil and made the next round and all that stuff. How much of that was luck and how much of that is just careful preparation and success? I don't know. Maybe in that order, if you look back on it.
That game in the Silverdome, Bora Milutinovic, the U.S. coach, actually said before the game, "I hope it's 200 degrees and 3,000% humidity," or I forget the exact numbers he said.
I think it was pretty close, if I remember correctly.
Because he had been drilling his players in this continuous national team camp for 18 months, just practice, 2-a-days, 3-a-days. Those guys were fit. He had them at his disposal for months and months and months. And they did endless runs on the beach in Mission Viejo. And he knew that they were going to be fitter than the Swiss players who'd just be coming off the long European season. There's even, a little bit of conspiracy theorizing that there were these big fans that were supposed to get the air moving in there, and that day 2 of them were turned off, or that possibly another version of it was that Bora turned at least one of them off because he wanted it to get hot in there. And, the Silverdome was a football stadium. It had no air conditioning because it was built for the football season and the time of year when you're trying to keep the heat in, not out, right? And so they'd rolled in this grass and they watered it way too zealously. So it was just everybody in there was slowly getting poached, right? But the American players, they were ready for that. And they were, even Tab Ramos told me that, even midsummer games on the artificial turf outdoors in Houston weren't as uncomfortable as he'd been in the Silverdome that day. But, Eric Winalda gets just enough dip, possibly because of the humidity, on that free kick that equalizes the game just before halftime, and then the U.S. is on its way, right? They'd hoped to win that game. They thought between games against Romania, Colombia, and Switzerland, their best chance of winning and giving themselves a chance of getting out of the group was going to be against Switzerland, so they were disappointed. But then, of course, they have this fluky win over Colombia, which they've played a lot in recent years and which kept winning. They win that game, and then they're through, albeit not that comfortably because they lose their final game against Romania, and they wind up advancing as one of the best third-place teams. If they had either beaten Switzerland or tied Romania, they would have advanced and probably, if memory serves, played Spain or Argentina, which, powerhouses too, but they weren't nearly as good as Brazil, who they faced in the next round and ultimately wound up winning that World Cup. So there's a bit of a missed opportunity there as well.
And clearly the tournament was an unmitigated success. The U.S. national team looked great in the halo. MLS got started in 1996. In many respects, it seems like there was much momentum. I love, though, your thoughts and some your recollections, that some of what you talk about in the book. This weird trough that happens in between this and 2002, because, and I'm using the World Cup sort of as benchmarks and stuff, but 1998, you got 2 years of MLS under your belt. You come in last in that tournament. I mean, you talk about like it almost like erases all of that success and that progress, it seems, in just a 3-week period of time during that tournament. And then to come back in 2002 in this sort of first Asian World Cup, and sadly, in the middle of the night in most places in the United States, arguably overperform. I mean, if not for a handball or a questionable handball against Germany, they could have made the quarterfinals. How do you explain that period of time? Because as a longtime fan, right, it's a high, it's a low, it's another high again, and it's a roller coaster of emotions if you cared about this. And I think many more people did in the diaspora and the halo of 94.
So World Cups are a matter of timing, right? It's some teams are they get the timing exactly right, or at least timing gets them right, I suppose. And everybody's peaking right around the World Cup. Everybody's fit. The team has the right momentum. It's what the U.S. is hoping for right now. Right on the precipice of another World Cup on home soil. You hope that the current U.S. team didn't peak too soon, because they were really good in the fall, right? When they won a bunch of big games and they looked very convincing. And what I think you saw in 1998 is a team that was kind of caught between generations. You had sort of the old guard from 90 and 94 was hanging around, but not really automatic starters anymore. And they were upset about that. You had a young, inexperienced coach, Steve Sampson, who'd never been a head coach of a professional team before, let alone a national team, who maybe got a little bit overzealous in the way that he approached the job. You had a fractious locker room where everybody was fighting with everyone. So sort of a perfect storm of dysfunction, and things will come apart really quickly in a World Cup, right? Whereas in 1990, they'd been sort of in these Spartan barracks in Italy, and the players were upset about that. 1998, U.S. Soccer puts them up in this beautiful chateau in France outside Lyon, and nevertheless, the players find a way to get upset about that and to just let their anxieties and their grievances fester, and the whole thing just turns into just a big muddled disaster, and they lose all 3 of their games. Now, by 2002, much of that generation is phased out, although Bruce Arena, having taken over from Steve Sampson, keeps some of the old guard around, which is kind of amazing given how toxic the last cycle had been, and introduces this fresh talent that's coming from this incubator U.S. Soccer has started in Bradenton, Florida, at the IMG Academy, where it had sort of housed the under-17 national team full-time. Len and Donovan, DeMarcus Beasley come out of that. And so you've got all this fresh young talent and energy. You've got a no-nonsense coach, and they kind of catch lightning in a bottle, which you tend to see that World Cups that are far afield from sort of the sports European center tend to be a bit more unpredictable. Right, so you have at that World Cup, you've got South Korea makes it to the semifinals. Turkey, I believe, makes it to the semifinals. You've got all these Cinderella runs. The U.S. very nearly makes it to the semifinal, because they beat Mexico in the round of 16 to the quarterfinal. So they almost advance. And so, that World Cup, they get the timing right. By 2006, Bruce Arena likes to say that team was 1 year past its peak. They were still good in 2005. By 2006, it was too late. And they have another wasted World Cup in Germany.
While this is all going on, I want to circle into the tens, because it's certainly another period of time after coming up and down, another sort of upswing. Put in relief, though, especially for our audience who, maybe doesn't understand this U.S. national team, at least on the senior level. I'm not even talking the Olympics and all the other supportive teams and or tournaments out there. This sort of more domestic or regional play, right? Because these games, these international windows that we now know them to be, things like the Gold Cup and all these other sort of this thing called CONCACAF, right? Which is sort of this regional grouping that has all the North American and Central American teams and stuff, and various competitions and stuff. The role of those tournaments, well, I would argue, only grew maybe simultaneously alongside the maturation, I guess, of the U.S. soccer preparation process.
Yeah, no, it's the region kind of comes up as one kind of entity, right? Because it's a weird region, CONCACAF, right? You've got
Very, very
sort
much
of
so.
yeah, you've got Mexico, which is this sort of not quite a blue chip national team program, but it's sort of close. It's definitely kind of in that second tier. Historic, has had good runs more often than not, makes it out of the group stage
And
at the World Cup.
historically always had the U.S.'s number back in the
Yeah.
dark days.
Yeah, and then you've got the US, which is, full of potential, but not really a soccer country for much of its sort of sporting history. Then you've got Canada, nobody's even sure what to make of them, right? And then they don't make very many World Cups until recently. And then you've got the Caribbean and Central America, which are most definitely soccer countries, but they're very small, right? So it's just a strange region. There was a vote a while ago about whether Greenland was going to be admitted, right? So you've got sort of this grab bag of very different countries of very, very different sizes, where suddenly, the United States and all of its economic might can be playing against St. Lucia or whoever. And so it's a strange confederation. I think it took them a while to figure out how to create regional tournaments that were fair and compelling and that sort of could capture some of the imagination. And I think they're still really tinkering with that formula in a lot of ways.
And what was your sense at this time in the tens, or the aughts and the tens, mostly the tens, I guess, of Major League Soccer's contribution or not? Because I think a lot of people, even those at the time, and certainly those who look back and go, and maybe even still today, who look at MLS, certainly then and even maybe questionably now, is it enough of a preparation for world-class competition? And this sort of age-old debate, or at least decades-old debate, about whether should one ply one's trade domestically for the good of the domestic soccer scene, or should one ply his trade, or her trade now, in other leagues that arguably are much, maybe not so arguably, much stronger on a day-to-day and consistent basis to better prep for these 4-year cycles?
So this requires a nuanced answer, I think. It's interesting.
And its own
actually.
episode. I apologize for sure.
That's okay. So Steve Sampson, after one of his explanations to me about the 1998 World Cup failure was the start of MLS. He actually said, I had players who were playing at the highest level in Italy and Spain and Germany and all these countries, and they came home to play in a much less competitive league. And I feel that actually damaged me as the national team head coach because it made them worse players. I think whether, the age-old debate about whether players are better off playing a lot in MLS and being leading players the way Landon Donovan was, or going to Europe and maybe bouncing around and not starting everywhere they go and kind of having to scrap for playing time, whether that's better in a more competitive environment. What I will say is that the piece of the puzzle that has inarguably improved the national team program is the MLS academies. Whereas when US Soccer opened its incubator in Bradenton, it was called Project 2010, that would have been 1999, I believe. That was basically the only high-level youth soccer environment, sort of professional pipeline in the United States, right? Now we have dozens of them. We have 30 Major League Soccer teams. They all have their own academies. They all have high-level training environment for young players. And then there's a whole bunch of club setups outside of the MLS infrastructure that are doing the same thing, just minus the professional team at the top of the pyramid. So if nothing else, MLS has vastly accelerated and improved the youth development system that we have, because most of those teams at most of the age groups are free. And that was a long time issue in American youth soccer, is that it was very, very expensive to play travel soccer. But now if you're in one of those markets, and arguably there are not yet enough of those markets to cover the entire country, and you're good enough, you're going to be able to play for free in a high-level environment, and that's obviously a net good to the national team. I think ultimately that there being more opportunities for players, more places for them to play, whether it be domestically or abroad, is also a benefit. You know, if they can't get a contract abroad, or if they need more maturation, or if they use MLS as a kind of jump off point to a European career, as players are increasingly doing, I think the more pathways you have and the more routes you have into the national team, the better.
Tell me about some of these players too, as we kind of go from the tens and closer to the, this decade. Another high point, right, was certainly the 2010 World Cup, and you memorably had Andres Cantor on Univision with an epic call of Landon Donovan's stoppage time goal against Algeria that enabled them to win a group for the first time, I think, since the first tournament ever, right back when the U.S. was participating. Somebody like Landon Donovan, clearly a generational talent and marquee name that even the casual fan had no choice but to notice. But I think part of that's also, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it was also part of the fact that the soccer thing was becoming much more legitimate as a sport. I mean, maybe because the U.S. national team was playing more domestic games and or international competitions that were, people were conscious of. The league was still around. It didn't fold like the NASL, as people would feared again. And other names started to become kind of known and expected to be. And frankly, the rankings, whatever you think about these FIFA rankings, we started to show up on a regular basis. Give me a little bit of the potpourri of some of those things that kind of pop in your mind from this period.
Well, I mean, what I love about that team and the new team is that they're just such rich and interesting characters, right? So you've got Landon Donovan, who's sort of this sensitive California boy who makes these very conscious decisions, where he's at Bayer Leverkusen, and sort of one of the premier setups in Germany, and he says, "No, I'm going to leave. I'm happier in California," right? And he basically spends most of his career in the MLS. He makes these little detours to Bayern Munich and to Everton. But he always comes home to California in the end, because he's like, this is where I want to be. I'm a soccer player, but it's not my entire life, and it's not going to dictate my happiness. And then you've got Clint Dempsey, who's just this ball of ambition and sort of this cutthroat forward from Nacogdoches, Texas, who will not stop at anything to sort of make his soccer dreams come true, and doesn't, and ultimately gets there, right? And winds up being the national team captain, even though he doesn't want to be, because he just keeps, it's something that he told me for the book, because he just has arguably the best American club career up until Christian Pulisic comes along, on the back of all that ambition and all of that sort of rage that he manages to channel, and, usually keeps just on the right side of acceptable behavior, but not always entirely. And then you look at the new generation of national team players. You've got in Pulisic, you finally have this sort of legitimate American superstar who, on the men's side, who comes to Chelsea to succeed Eden Hazard, and then goes to AC Milan and becomes arguably its best player. And at last, we have this star that we've been desperate for decades. And it turns out that he's not actually all that interested in stardom, that he's this really private guy who just wants to play soccer and wants to be left alone. And so I find him interesting, right? You've got his fellow sometime captain, Tyler Adams, who is the most no-nonsense young man you will ever encounter, who doesn't swap jerseys with opposing players after games because he's like, what am I going to do with somebody else's jersey? What's the use in that? He's not cynical exactly, but he's sort of very amusing in his disinterest in some of the trappings of professional soccer. Like, he doesn't go clubbing, he doesn't do anything like that. He just likes to save up his money, and he likes to go out and compete. And then you've got Weston McKennie, who's this sort of oddball, life of the party, completely unbound by inhibitions, but at the same time, right now, the key player on the Italian juggernaut Juventus, right, and who somehow manages to combine this character and this personality where he's trying to extract maximum fun from any situation he finds himself in, but is also able to kind of bring that seriousness and to just be a really good professional. There's just really great stories in the personalities on the US team, not just sort of in how they get to the national team, which is interesting, but also just in who they are. A lot of them are very unconventional professionals.
Well, that leads me to my last kind of sort of corral of questions, and we can go on for hours on the year by year and quadrennial by quadrennial cycles of all this stuff. And it obviously it's all in the book, friends. We're going to keep selling and pitching the book for sure, because the arc of this story is just it truly is a roller coaster in terms of expectations and delivery and all that stuff. But I guess the last sort of set of questions is kind of around the coaching cycles, right? I remember our conversation with Alan Rothenberg circling around a guy like Bora Milutinovic, right, for 1994, right, was a signal from U.S. soccer about something, right? And I think it largely comes down to a choice between, do you go for the gun for hire on the international coaching circuit, right, who brings a pedigree, he's worked and or played and or whatever, coached at various places and levels of the international game, and kind of gets you kind of prepared for the event, and you see how best you do? Or do you find somebody who is closer, if not himself generally, an American who understands the quote unquote American perspective, player personality base that you just described, that kind of stuff, because we're Americans and we're just different, and we need people who better understand that dynamic, and that's the best way to develop talent to play on the world stage. Maybe I've oversimplified it, but if you look back at this period of time that you cover in this book, it does seem to be, it's almost like a tension between those two general concepts.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, there's a very predictable pattern, actually, in the head coaching appointments on the U.S. men's national team that goes all the way back to the early 1980s, where they keep careening between an American coach and the most famous coach they can find, an international one, right? Sort of the late 70s, Walt Chisowitz is the head coach. They wind up replacing him with Alkis Panagoulias, who's this Greek guy who has an American passport as well, who coaches Team America and teaches the coaches the Olympic team after that. And then they have Lothar Osiander, who's sort of a German-American, and then Bob Gansler. And then after the 1990 World Cup, they decide, oh, what do we need? We need the most famous foreign, most pedigreed guy that we can find. And they hire Bora Milutinovic. And after that, they go, no, we need to go American again. And they have Sampson, and then they have Bruce Arena. And then so they have a prolonged period with Americans, Bob Bradley, and then they swing back and they convince themselves that to get to the next level, what we really need is a foreigner, someone who's super plugged into the global game, who's lived it, who's breathed it his whole life. They hire Jurgen Klinsmann. That winds up not working out great. After another spell with Bruce Arena, they get Greg Berhalter, because they're like, no, actually what we need is an American who understands the American game and who sort of grasps the American player and what he goes through. And once they're sort of done with Berhalter, they go to now the current head coach, Mauricio Pochettino, because he's the most famous and most highly qualified coach that they can find, right? It's basically been 45 years now of going through the exact same cycle, which is sort of funny when you put them all in a row.
All right. As we record this is a little bit before the 2026 tournament in whatever shape or form it plays out in. Not only do I want your commentary on what you think is going to happen as the tournament and all the various political and visa issues and the cost of tickets and all the kind of craziness and stuff, which to me has left me and a lot of other, I think, longtime American soccer fans with a very bitter taste. And this hasn't even begun to start yet. Where do you, before you give me those comments, how do you frame the U.S. national team now as we record this in terms of its Jekyll and Hyde kind of history over the last 40 years? Where do you think, is this going to be an up or a down or a sideways kind of experience for American soccer fans and this team and this competition and in this craziness that it's going to be this time?
I think it's going to be an up. I think they have the deepest and most talented and most pedigreed national team they've ever had. I think Pochettino has figured out how to get the best out of them. It took him a good year to sort of find his feet. He'd never been an international coach before. They were in really good form in the fall. We'll have to see if they can carry that on and into the World Cup. But World Cups are strange creatures, right? They're these one-off tournaments. Landon Donovan and Carlos Bocanegra, the erstwhile captain, said the same thing to me independently of each other in the book. And they said, I think they've both been to 3 World Cups. Maybe Bocanegra went to 2. But they said every World Cup I've ever played in has come down to one bounce, right? To the Algeria goal in 2010, and the US rescues what would have been a disaster campaign and sort of salvages it. Likewise, in 2006, they had a chance of getting through and ultimately didn't. In 2014, Chris Wondolowski scores against Belgium, and suddenly the US is in the quarterfinals again, right? So it always comes down to these tiny little moments. I think they're well positioned, especially with the expanded format, to find their feet in the group stage and then maybe win a knockout game or 2. It's worth noting here that the US has played 7 knockout games in World Cups in its entire history and won just one of them. So that would be an accomplishment, making the quarterfinals in this expanded format. As for the impact of the World Cup itself, I don't think it's going to come anything close to what the 1998 World Cup did, because A, there's no domestic league to sort of issue from it. But B, I think it's very much going to be a World Cup of the 1%, right? I think it's a World Cup that's going to be full of foreign fans who maybe are missing a few mortgage payments or spending the equivalent thereof to make it here. And I think it's unfortunately going to be a lot of doctors and people who work on Wall Street and just the people who have the kind of disposable income to drop $1,000 to go to an afternoon of soccer. So I don't think it's going to have the kind of grassroots tale that 94 did, which would have been hard to mimic in any case, but it's just not going to be terribly accessible. And so I think there's going to be a missed opportunity there in the impact that the tournament will ultimately have long term.
Yeah, sadly, I think I tend to agree with you on all that sentiment, and but that also affects like the experience in the stadiums too, right? You arguably you want the most passionate fans defending their honor for their countries, but there's also the size of it. I mean, 48 teams, 3 countries, and then you layer in all the political and geo-economic, all the economic stuff. I mean, it's just a big pot of. There's going to be drama. I don't know how much of it's going to be on the field, though. I think a lot of it's going to precede and maybe, be after effects and stuff. I guess the last question I'll sort of throw out there is, how do you sense this period that you talk about, right? I mean, would you argue that the U.S. national team and program, has assumed kind of the pinnacle of its 40 years, or do you still think it has places to go, not just on the performance and winning, cups and tournaments and stuff, but I mean, have we climbed the mountain yet, or is there still a ways to go in terms of programmatic success, so to speak, as an institution for this team?
I think there's still room for growth in the sense that basically the starting lineup now is going to consist primarily of guys playing for big European teams or for Premier League teams. That's new. Where I don't think we've sort of topped out yet is that only a few of those guys are really counted on by their teams to carry the load week after week and to make sure that those teams win, right? Tyler Adams is a very effective and very successful role player for Bournemouth. Same with Anthony Robinson at Fulham. Christian Pulisic scores a lot of goals and gets a lot of assists at Milan, but like the game doesn't revolve around him, right? Weston McKennie plays in every imaginable position for Juventus, but he's not sort of the playmaker there, right? He's not the guy who makes it happen. So I think there's potential for some of the younger players to grow into that sort of player. But I think until you have a team that's full of players like that, the way some of the really like blue chip national teams do. You know, your Spains, your Germanys, your Frances, your Brazils, your Argentinas. I think there's more room to climb when they get to that place. That's when I really think you're going to start to see sort of where the summit really is for this program.
All right, and truly last question. Stepping back from your organic love of the game, are you looking forward to this tournament? I mean, both from a coverage perspective as well as the excitement, or do you worry about things perhaps maybe like I do in terms of what could go wrong, perhaps many scenarios?
Yes and yes. Like, I'm excited for it. World Cups are amazing. I'm going to be covering it primarily for The Guardian, where I write a weekly column. Like, this is going to be my fourth World Cups. They are an incredible thing to witness and to be around for. And I'm really excited for the soccer. I'm also worried about the US not face planting. I'm worried about the political piece of it and whether that could overshadow the entire thing. I'm worried about whether it will in some way tarnish further the reputation of this country abroad if, a bunch of tourists come here for the World Cup and wind up not having the experience that they're expecting. So yes, I'm very excited for the soccer and I'm worried about it coming off. But then I try to remind myself that there's controversy before every World Cup, and there's reason to be deeply concerned before every World Cup in memory, going back basically to Germany in 2006. Maybe that's a Eurocentric view, but World Cups tend to come off just fine once the ball rolls and people start cheering.
All right. My thanks to Leander. And look, if you're on the hunt for a comprehensive and entertaining backgrounder into the history of this U.S. national men's soccer team and want to amaze and impress your friends or maybe even enemies as you sit in the stands, if you're lucky enough to get a decently priced ticket, or at the bar or wherever you're congregating to watch these matches, you owe it to yourself to get yourself a copy of this tremendous book. It's a real work of substance, and you will learn so much about the tortured history, or torturous history, or both, frankly, of this U.S. men's national team. It is called, again, The Long Game, U.S. Men's Soccer and its Savage 4-Decade Journey to the Top, or Thereabouts. It is written by our guest this week, Leander Schaerlaeckens, and it is published by Viking, and of course, it is available wherever good books are found. And the convenient links, though, provided for you in our show description. However you're getting the podcast this week, the links will be there, or on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Search out this episode numbered 447 with myself and Leander, and you'll find the links there too. And those links will take you to our friends at Amazon, where you will get, as quickly as humanly possible, either the hard copy, I keep saying hard copy, I mean a hardcover copy, there you go, or Kindle version, or even audiobook version of this book, The Long Game. You will enjoy it to no end, and you will be well prepared for anything, the good, the bad, and the ugly that might happen with this U.S. national team. You'll have all the perspective that you need, regardless of how their play and their performance shakes out. While you're out there and about online, you can follow Leander in the various places, such as on Substack. Subscribe to his Soccer Stories newsletter. You'll enjoy that. You can read his doings around soccer coverage, both World Cup and otherwise, at The Guardian. Awesome journalistic site of quality and substance. Also, the new home, the relatively new home of our old pal Pablo Maurer, who's also doing soccer writing and stuff too. So double word score there to follow the soccer writing there at The Guardian. And you also, Leander's got a website. It is leanderalphabet.com. Leander is spelled Leander, alphabet, ALPHABET, leanderalphabet.com. And on Blue Sky, you can follow him socially at leanderalphabet.bsky.social. You know our website, goodseatsstillavailable.com. You'll find our socials there, but I'll rattle those off to you. Good Seats Still on X. You'll find us on the Blue Sky thing at goodseatsstillavailable.com. and just about everywhere else, including YouTube, where we stream all these episodes as well, at Good Seats Still Available. Our email address, and write this down if you want to enter this contest for this book, is hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. Happy to take any general correspondence there. But this week we've got 3 copies, courtesy of our friends at Viking. Thank you very much to them for allowing us to do this. And if you're one of the first 3 to correctly answer this trivia question, and we timestamp them so we know when they come in, but even if you're listening hours or days or even maybe a week or 2 after the release of this show, you never know. It takes a while to get all the 3 right answers sometimes to these questions. So if you think you still have a shot, go for it. And here is that question. Soccer players, when they play internationally for their national teams, achieve something, an honor known as a cap. Now, it goes back to British soccer back in the 1800s, where literally they would give a cap, a commemorative cap, something that they would wear, that would commemorate the fact that they made the team and that they played a game internationally representing their country. So when you play a game, you get a cap, and it's more figurative now than it is actual these days. So the question is this: what is the player that has achieved the most caps, that is the most appearances, playing for the U.S. national team in the history of this program? Who has the most appearances or achieved the most caps in U.S. men's national soccer team history? It's a pretty straightforward question, pretty easy question. And if you're one of the first 3 people to answer that correctly, you will win a copy of this awesome book by Leander called The Long Game. Happy to give it to you for the correct answer. And again, send those entries and just put the contest entry thing in the subject title so I know. And again, it's hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. All right. I appreciate you listening this far. Thanks for participating in the contest if you're choosing to do so. Our thanks, of course, to Jerry Payne for his weekly audio excellence. And thank you for listening. Have a wonderful beginning of summer. It's May already. No, it's not. It's June already. No, it's not. It's hard to believe, but Memorial Day's already passed, and it's still late May. So I don't know what's going on. Hopefully you do. We'll see you next week. Hopefully. Bye.